Morning, everybody. Baptism, my name's Matt, by the way. Good to see you. Baptism mornings are always my favorite mornings, and everything else after that feels like a letdown, so sorry. We'll do our best. But in these days of political rancor, it might be helpful to recall the uneasy friendship of America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. The portly and curmudgeonly Adams and the stately and romantic Jefferson, they were friends in the early days. They worked together to establish America's independence from British colonial rule. They respected each other's intellect and patriotism. As America got up on its feet, though, their political differences diverged. Adams believed in a strong central federal government. Jefferson believed in states' rights. They had different opinions about France and Great Britain and personal rights. Each was convinced of the rightness of their cause and the heinousness of the others. They were forced by circumstances to work together. Adams was elected president in 1796, and because Jefferson came in second, he was the vice president. But eventually, they grew so distasteful of each other's politics that they stopped talking for 12 years. It was only after a mutual friend sent them each a letter saying that the other wished to reestablish contact, which was a lie, that they re-engaged each other in their old age. What followed was one of the most interesting pen-pal relationships in American history. They bickered over politics, but rekindled their friendship and spoke longingly of the days that they drank mead in the pub, discussing the finer points of political philosophy. Over the course of a few years, Jefferson and Adams exchanged 185 letters. You probably note that these on-again, off-again friends, they actually died on the same day, mere hours apart, on July 4th, 1826, which just happens to be the exact day of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, why the history lesson this morning? Because the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson illustrates how difficult it can be to remain friends with someone whose politics are so opposed to yours. Even these two political giants had trouble doing it. But their friendship also illustrates how possible it is, with the right amount of humility and love and letter writing. And it's also what I want to talk to you about this morning. We're in a series here at Rooftop called I Have a Friend Who. And we're talking about how we can be a better friend to the people in our lives with what they're going through. Jesus sends his people to the ends of the earth to baptize people, and make disciples of all people, of all nations. We don't necessarily have to go to the ends of the earth to do that, though. It can start with our friends. It should start with our friends. We all have friends who have challenges and problems just like we do. How can we love our friends with the love of Jesus? How can we love our friends who are sick? How can we love our friends who are lonely? How can we love our friends who are depressed or irreligious or atheists or LGBTQ? This morning, I want to talk about how we can love our friends who are way too political or hyper-political or political radicals, however you want to phrase it. There is both a good chance and a small chance that we have friends who are political radicals. There is a good chance because we live in a hyper-partisan era in which political division is flaring. I mean, how many articles and news stories have we seen about political divisions just tearing friendships and families apart? We all have that loony liberal college friend or that crazy conservative neighbor. But there is a small chance that we have friends who are hyper-political because by this time, a lot of those friendships have actually ruptured. I bet we all have friends on the other side of the political spectrum with whom we just don't talk anymore. I know you can't see the finer points of this graphic, but according to a Pew poll from a few years ago, a strong majority of Americans admit they have no friends or few friends who even voted for the opposing presidential candidate. A recent article on NPR interviewed a lot of people who admitted that given the political environment, they just felt they needed to cut off contact with friends and family members whose hateful and ignorant and racist politics went beyond what they considered tolerable. Even I will freely admit to unfriending, literally unfriending, and unfollowing a not insignificant number of people on my social media feeds whose one-sided and antagonistic posts went beyond anything I wanted to read on a regular basis. I've also been trying just to spend less time on social media, so the timing was convenient. Now, this is certainly a trend in America today. People are just growing even more tribalized online and in life. We're grouping up with others with whom we share ideologies. That way we don't have to put up with other people who disagree with us, and we can just have our own views reinforced at will. And if we are able to maintain those relationships with people we view as radicals, we do so very uneasily. We just agree with them explicitly or implicitly just to not talk about it. We work really hard to avoid what we're actually thinking just so we can keep the peace. Now, I actually think that not talking to people about divisive topics can sometimes be a good idea. And keeping your distance from people so that you don't have to hear their conspiracy theories or political vitriol is maybe sometimes appropriate. But it doesn't seem to me, and I'm speaking to myself here, it doesn't seem to me that cutting off friends or shutting down conversation with friends is generally the best way forward for followers of Jesus. What does Jesus say about this? Well, let's start with the obvious. Love your enemies. Loving your enemies probably doesn't mean unfriending them. Or as Paul says, accept one another without passing judgment on each other. And elsewhere, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. And be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Basically, God expects his people to engage with others, even if they have politics different than ours, even if they are political radicals, even if they think we're idiots. How do we do that, though? How do we love our friends who are way too political? Well, this is actually a very difficult question. It's a difficult question for lots of reasons. First, it's a difficult question because we ourselves might be hyper-political, or at least very political. As much as we think our friends have gone off the rails, they might think we have gone off the rails. We all have a tendency to think that we are the normal ones, and that people who disagree with us are in the crazy minority. There's even a term in psychology for this. It's called the false consensus effect. And the false consensus effect is that which describes people who tend to believe that their opinions are part of the shared consensus that, most people have, and that people who disagree with them are radicals and outliers. It's a false consensus because it may or may not be true that we're in the majority and they're in the minority. And we might actually be blind to our own radicalism. The other problem here is one of definition. What are we even talking about? What does it even mean to be hyper-political? When does being a political person even become a problem? Well, let's start there. We need to acknowledge first the reality and the inevitability of politics. You see, we're all political. As Aristotle put it famously centuries ago, man is a political animal by nature. What he means is that we are social creatures who are drawn to live in community. To live in community requires us to build systems that allow us to function as a community. The larger our communities get, the more sophisticated those systems need to be. This community is our polis, or our city. Polis is the Greek word for city, and that's what the word politics refers to, the government and organization of the polis of which we are a part. Now, over the centuries, humanity has discovered that we can organize our governments and our policies in a variety of different ways. I don't mean to sound like I'm giving a civics lesson this morning, but communities can be more or less democratic. They can be more or less capitalistic. They can be more or less representative, more or less secular, bureaucratic, pluralistic, technocratic, republican, theocratic, meritocratic. Basically, there's lots of different ways that governments have learned to function. Regardless of those ways, if you are at all a participant in the political affairs of your community, you are a political person. Everybody is. It's unavoidable. We are political animals by nature. If you vote, you're a political person. If you pay taxes, you're a political person. If you participate in a civic organization, or if you have an opinion on how things should run, or if you obey the law, or if you don't obey the law, you are a political person. And it's good to be a political person. That means you're part of your polis. It's especially good to be a political person in our own country. Our nation, America, was founded on the belief that people should have a voice in their polis. We are founded on the virtue of political engagement. Thomas Jefferson is alleged to have said, "An educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people." So he's reflecting the belief of the founders that the more people know and the more people are engaged with their leaders and communities, the healthier is our republic. This is actually one of the things that has made America stand out over the years. It's what Alexis de Tocqueville, the French intellectual, observed about America when he traveled through our young nation in the early 1800s. He said, "The thing America has going for it is the broad involvement of the vast majority of its citizens in civic affairs." So far, so good. It's not wrong to be involved in politics. In fact, more of us should probably be more involved in politics for the health of our nation. What's the problem then? The problem occurs when our politics undermine our shared understanding of basic human virtues such as kindness, respect, and cooperation. The problem occurs when politics turns us into mean people. You, of course, know this is happening across our nation on both sides of the political divide. You probably also know that politicians and the media make it happen. They stoke dissent. They are saying things to make us afraid of the other side because they know that we will be more reliable voters and supporters of their cause if we are motivated by fear and hate. Both sides do this. Just last fall, we had an election. Remember the election? We got through it okay. Some of you are still celebrating. Some of you are still weeping. I remember during the election, or in the lead up to the election, though, I remember getting mailers practically every day that were just ridiculous, designed to scare me. Huge mailers in black and red intended to terrify me. Democrats want to open the border to murderers. Republicans want to kill trans kids. I'm like, can we stop? Can we stop? Well, no, we can't stop. We won't stop. Do you know why we won't stop? Because the people in charge of these things know those tactics work. As a result, all sorts of people in our lives and maybe even ourselves are being pushed further and further to the political fringe. And we're not better for it. Our communities aren't better for it. Our souls aren't better for it. I mean, the more politically radical we become, the less able we are to share Jesus with the people in our lives, and the less we can actually get to know him. Which brings us back to our question, how can we help our friends who are hyper-political? How can we help ourselves? Well, as usual, we can help them by following Jesus. You might not know this, but Jesus had politically radical friends. One of the things we forget about the ministry of Jesus is that he arrived in a very political time. First century Israel was a hotbed of political dissent and violence. It still is, Israel. Jesus even put political radicals on his team of disciples. Simon the Zealot was a member of a group of violent Jewish radicals. Matthew was a tax collector who would have been regarded as a traitor to the Jews. and a co-conspirator with the Romans. People occasionally tried to trap Jesus in political opinion so they could get him into trouble, right? Should we pay our taxes to Caesar? Should we rebel against Rome? Jesus stepped into this rancorous political environment. He didn't cut people off. He didn't unfriend them. He didn't argue them into submission. He showed them something else. And that's the best way we can help our friends. We can show them Jesus. Specifically, we can show them Jesus' peace. We can show them Jesus' priorities. We can show them Jesus' purity. And we can show them Jesus' passion. First, we can show them Jesus' peace. Jesus tells his disciples in John 14, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Now, I'm not going to deny that there are really important issues at stake right now in our world. I mean, pick your cause. It's an important one. Matters an awful lot to a lot of people. If you're a progressive, you might believe that we are literally destroying the planet and letting oligarchs oppress the poor and taking away hard-earned human rights. If you're a conservative, you might think that we are destroying families, failing to address crime, and burdening our children with unpayable debt. Whatever your position, the stakes are high and the future looks grim, especially if the other side gets their way. But, is it still possible to trust in God while living in this broken and divisive world? Is it possible, even in these times, to know God's peace? Of course it is. We can know Jesus' peace because of what he has given us in the gospel of the Holy Spirit, who reminds us daily that no matter how off the rails our world is, God is still in control. He's still coming soon. The world doesn't want us believing that, by the way. I mean, note what Jesus says. "I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not be afraid like the world wants you to be." The world wants you to be afraid. Politicians and the media want us to be afraid. They tell us stories and they use headlines and graphics to make us afraid. And they do so not necessarily because they really care about the issues, but because the more afraid we are, the more likely they can hold on to their power. That's not true of all politicians, of course. It's true of a lot of them, but it's definitely not true of Jesus. Jesus is the only leader I've ever known who got up and said, "You know what? Everything's going to be all right. In fact, if you believe in me, everything already is." The reason Jesus isn't a politician is because he never would have gotten elected with that message. You don't get elected by telling people everything's all right. You get elected by telling people that the world is burning. Now, to be sure, Jesus has things to say about the world's burning. But it's nothing we need to be afraid of because he has given us his peace. Let's show our friends Jesus' peace. Secondly, let's show our friends Jesus' priorities. Now, you might have figured this out about me, but I tend to be a moderate on a lot of things, but I do skew conservative on social and economic questions. Not that that should matter. That's just where I'm at. Hopefully you can still respect me, up to you. But I also recognize that's just one way of looking at the world, and it's highly influenced by my own experiences in life. If I had grown up in a different environment, I'd probably have developed a different way of looking at the world politically. Now, while I like my political opinions, that's why I have them, I'm also not going to assume it's the only legitimate way that things should work. Nor am I going to impugn the motives of people who disagree with me. They're just seeing things differently, prioritizing different things, and I'm glad they do. Having to disagree is what keeps us honest and on our toes. It's what gives our republic balance. It was Rick Warren who said years ago that we need two parties in this country because a bird with one wing cannot fly very well. Even in the church, it's good to have political differences. Rooftop, you know this, does that really well. What we do need to remember, though, and what we need to demonstrate to our friends is where Jesus' priorities always lie, regardless of our differences. And here's the truth. His priorities always lie with helping the sick and the poor. Jesus actually gave a little bit of a campaign kickoff speech in the Gospel of Luke, and he makes his priorities, his campaign priorities, clear. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because, here's why I'm here, he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. I mean, if you've read the Gospels, you know who Jesus hung out with. He hung out with sick people and impoverished people and rejected people and irreligious people. He spoke against greed and wealth and power. That's just the truth. My point is that whatever our politics, as Christians, those should be our priorities. And they can be. Many progressives believe their party better represents the cause of the poor, but that's not necessarily true. There's as much power and greed on the left as there is on the right. I know conservatives who believe their philosophy of government does a better job serving the poor. I also know people who are conservative because of the tax advantages. All that to say, it's complicated. What shouldn't be complicated, though, is where our priorities should be as Christians. Serving the poor, caring for the sick, adopting orphans. I don't always know how to vote. I go into the voting booth really confused every election. But I know what Jesus is going to ask me at the end of my life. What did you do for the least of these? Whatever you did for the poor, whatever you did for the hungry, whatever you did for the imprisoned, you did for me. If we want to help our friends, show them Jesus' peace, show them Jesus' priorities. Thirdly, we should show them Jesus' purity. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, one of the most upsetting things to have watched over the years is how Christians have given up on our moral values in order to achieve short-lived political power. If you were alive back in the 1980s, you might remember the moral majority. Anybody old like me remember the moral majority? Broadly speaking, the moral majority was a pro-life movement that wanted to bring Christian values of decency and morality back into public life. The leaders of this movement believed that our politicians should be held to high moral standards. Things like adultery and lying were bad. Of course, this was always kind of hypocritical. One of the leaders in this movement was Bill Bennett, who was Secretary of Education during Reagan's term, and was author of the Book of Virtues, which was kind of a textbook on basic morality. Bennett was eventually exposed as having a very expensive, high-stakes gambling addiction, even while he preached against the dangers of money and wrote books about it. He wasn't the only one. Jerry Falwell Jr. was revealed as a womanizing philanderer who lived high on the hog. Not only was this sense of moralism hypocritical, though, it was just convenient. It worked at the time until Christians realized that most Americans don't actually care about morality, and we don't need to either. We just want leaders who will advance their agenda one way or the other, and we don't care how they live their lives. It's kind of where we're at now. Now, I'm actually becoming slowly convinced that it's hard for anybody to run for office, at least national office, and maintain their moral integrity. It's not impossible. It just seems really hard. There's too many pitfalls, too much money and power. That's why I'm really never sure which sinner to vote for in the election. You just kind of hold your nose, like, oh, I don't want. But while I'm sort of resigned to voting for sinners, I know what God expects of me. And that's love, compassion, and humility. That's what he expects of me. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus tells me. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you, Matt Herndon, will not see the kingdom of heaven. And also, he tells me, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you, Matt Herndon, as well. Now, Jesus is not describing the rightness of our political cause here. He's describing our moral purity, our spiritual integrity. He's talking about how we think and how we must love each other. Let me just speak directly here, and you can hate me if you want. I've been hated before. But if you cannot speak your political beliefs without the compassion and the kindness and the humility and the civility of Jesus Christ, if you cannot speak your political opinions without the compassion and the kindness and the humility and the civility of Jesus Christ, you need to be quiet. You need to be quiet. You need to be quiet and go get to know Jesus again. And be reminded of how much he loves you, a sinner, so that you can love other people the same way. If we want to help our friends, we need to show them Jesus' peace, Jesus' priorities, Jesus' purity. And lastly, we need to show them Jesus' passion. So I don't want to create the impression that Jesus was calm and peaceful and didn't really engage in political questions while on this earth. Like I said, he waded in. But he always kept things in perspective. He never lost sight of the larger drama of God's kingdom coming to earth and the relative smallness of political questions. Someone once asked him if people should pay taxes to Caesar, which would basically be supporting the regime of a foreign dictator. And Jesus kind of brushes it off. He's like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, sure. But give to God what is God's. Basically, pay your taxes, doesn't matter, as long as God is getting what he is owed, which is, your very lives. There is one moment, though, when Jesus flies off the handle, and we see how passionate he can be about these things. It's at the temple. You probably know the scene. I think every gospel writer records it, but let me tell you John's version, or Matthew's version. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has consumed me. Now, I hope I'm not stretching this passage, and forgive me if I am, but I actually think of this moment when I think of the church today. Plenty of people turned the church into what they want it to be. These people had turned it into a market. Some people, though, they turned the church into a country club or social cause. But plenty of churches have actually been turned into political organizations and rallies for their favorite candidates. And I'm not convinced that Jesus doesn't feel about those churches what he felt about this temple. What he was upset about was the sanctity of the temple that was being violated. It wasn't their temple, it was God's house. It was built to be a place of prayer to God where people from all nations could come and meet him, but they had put up booths and ATMs and flags and flyers. We've all been to churches like that, or we've seen them, churches that are basically political rallies. How would people from the nations feel like in those churches? How would Jesus feel? Would Jesus feel home there? Would he feel like he's in God's house? Or would he flip some tables? Now, I'm not saying that Christians and churches can't get involved in these things, but is that what we really want to be passionate about? As God's people? Do we want to preach the gospel of America, progressive or conservative version? Or do we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ? Do your friends need to know what you think about Trump or Biden or Kamala? Or do your friends need to know what you think about Jesus? And how he alone has changed your life? And how he alone is the King of Kings? In fact, let me close with a quick story from last fall. So plenty of Americans were nervous about the election last November. There has been a fair amount of political violence and rancor, and you remember we weren't sure how things were going to go. You know how things went. You also might have been surprised at how peacefully the day unfolded, relatively speaking. That's actually certainly how it went around here. Rooftop serves as a polling location. So 2 or 3 times a year, we open our doors to the community to support the democratic process. We're honored to do that. We're honored to do so as Christians. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, writes the author of the Hebrews. So we did. Thanks to Keith Pruitt and our hard work and hospitality team, we started brewing coffee for people at 5 a.m. Rained all morning, so we had staff members running rooftop umbrellas out into the parking lot for people standing in the rain. We had snacks and pastries. We were delivering them to voters standing in line. I ran up to Federhofer's, get donuts for the poll workers who were here 15 hours that day. There was laughing, socializing going on. People were actually announcing on Facebook that if they hadn't voted yet, they should go to Rooftop for the warm hospitality and hot coffee. All in all, we had nearly 1,000 people walk through our building. No fights broke out. No one was demeaned or yelled at. No votes were misplaced, as far as I could tell. I was keeping my eyes open. No opinions were suppressed. Now, we didn't baptize anybody or make any converts, but we showed our friends and neighbors what the church can be, what the church should be, right? Place of service and hospitality and community. The church can be that because that's who Jesus is. That's how he loves us. That's what he showed us in his life on earth and his death on a cross. That's what our friends need to see. The Jeffersons, the Adams in our lives, that's what we need to see from us. And if we love them, as Christ loves us, that's what we get to show them.